Hello there, welcome to Quarantine Quandary. You'll find the name Waterloo plastered all over Britain. Waterloo Street, Waterloo Place, Waterloo Bridge, famous movie of the 1940s. Waterloo Station, where Terry and Julie meet. In the song by the Kinks, the famous Waterloo Sunset. All this in honour of the Battle of Waterloo, which was fought on this day, the 18th of June, 1815. That's 6:15. Since this was the battle, this brought the end of Napoleon's rule in mainland Europe. The commander-in-chief of the Allied forces was the Duke of Wellington. No, not Duke Ellington, the Duke of Wellington. And he was a national hero. In addition to things being named after Waterloo, there were plenty of things named after Wellington. The Wellington Arch in London, which stands in the middle of a roundabout shared by Apsley House, the home of the Duke of Wellington, Buckingham Palace, and the Hard Rock Cafe. Wellington favoured a type of boot known as a Hessian boot, but his was styled without tassels. And this boot became known as the Wellington boot, as it was very popular, as all men of society wanted to emulate the great war hero. 15 years later, and he's Prime Minister. The King in the Battle of Waterloo, George IV, had died, and William IV, his younger brother, was on the throne. 1830, very important time. Reform Bill. Wellington was dead against it. In those days, not many people had the vote. It was only men, and usually titled men, and men who owned land. The shopkeeper class was just coming in and wanting representation in Parliament. There were also things known as rotten boroughs. Small villages would secure a seat in Parliament, equivalent to a large city. People protested countrywide and grew with passion as well. And some became riots, torching of buildings, range of propaganda, an anonymous informer on the local media, which was newspapers and billboards, a man called Captain Swing, who was trying to stir up trouble against the administration. This is 1830, don't forget. Crying out for votes. For at that time, barely 1 in 5 males could vote. It was over 100 years later that women got to vote, and that all men were allowed to vote. The voting age of 18 wasn't introduced until 1969. So this reform bill, they were trying to push through Parliament. Wellington was dead against it. He wanted to take a hard line against the protesters. His position as Prime Minister was untenable and had to step down. Although he was Prime Minister again for about 3 months, a couple of years later. But he became the great elder statesman of the country in the way that Churchill did after World War II. The coronation of Queen Victoria was to take place in Westminster Abbey after she ascended the throne in 1837. In fact, the Queen herself was very worried about Westminster Abbey, known to have sparrows within. They'd get up into the high parts and worried that they might disrupt the service. People were positing ideas. How do we deal with the sparrows? Do we build scaffolding and catch them that way or shoot them? And Wellington was asked by Her Majesty Queen Victoria, how do we deal with the sparrows in Westminster Abbey? He looked at her and said, sparrowhawks, ma'am. Wellington died in 1852 in his early 80s. He's buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. National war hero, sometime Prime Minister and statesman. I liked him. Never met him though, and I think he's one of Britain's great heroes. Arthur Wellesley, first Duke of Wellington, great victor of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815.